You are a 7-year-old girl, playing carelessly in your village when you hear the pounding of footsteps in the night. Your family is asleep, unaware of the horror creeping toward your doorstep. By the time you realize the danger, it's too late. Raiders burst through the door, and before you can even cry out, you're dragged away, your small body powerless against them. They're not here for gold. They don't want your family's tribute. No, they're here for you. And in the blink of an eye, you're torn away from everything you've ever known. Your mother's cries echo in your ears as they take you. She tries to hold you, but they're too powerful. This isn't a dream. This is real. The last thing you hear is her voice, the one that's always comforted you, fading as you are carried further and further away. You'll never see your family again. You'll never feel safe again. What if your life, your humanity, was reduced to nothing more than a commodity, a marketable object to be bought, sold, and traded? What if your very existence was determined by the whims of strangers, by the ownership of someone else? What if you, just like millions of others, were destined to be a tool, a body, used for pleasure and labor in an empire that thrived on your suffering? The Ottoman Empire, known for its grand palaces, magnificent architecture, and military might, was built on this very system. The empire controlled the fate of millions across 3 continents, yet beneath the golden walls of its palaces, behind the grandeur, lurked a dark and disturbing truth. It wasn't just about conquest, power, or wealth. It was about control over the most vulnerable members of society, women and girls reduced to chattel, bought and sold in markets of human flesh. What we're about to uncover is a forgotten history, a history so disturbing that even contemporary witnesses struggled to document it. But it must be told. This is not just one horrific story. This is the reality for countless women who lived under the reign of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a few isolated incidents. It was a system designed for exploitation, a system designed to turn human beings into mere commodities. Now, let's explore how this empire, under the guise of civilization, reduced its women to nothing more than products to be traded, abused, and discarded, and how this dark legacy still echoes through history, shaping the lives of millions even today. This video is about to introduce you to a dark aspect of the Ottoman Empire that has been hidden behind the curtains of history, a system that turned the lives of women and girls into mere commodities. The size of the empire and its military power were famous across most of the world, but beneath its grandeur lay a dark truth that we often overlook. However, the women who were part of this system were not just objects to be counted. They were human beings whose fates were controlled by the most powerful people in the empire. But why was this system in place? How was it established? And how did this system use women as commodities? Today, we are going to uncover the truth. The Ottoman Empire institutionalized the exploitation of women and girls as an official policy. Legal and cultural frameworks were established to control these women's lives. It wasn't just about ensuring they were bought and sold. It was also about making sure that the entire system was legally supported. Understanding the true nature of these policies is essential to realize that this wasn't just a mistake, but an integral part of the societal structure. When we consider how this system spread globally, we cannot view it merely as an unfortunate incident. It was part of the empire's strategy. In the Ottoman Empire, when a person's life was bought and sold in such a manner, with no rights or protection under the law, this system became a reality of human rights violations that affected generations. Looking at these events today, one question arises in our minds. Was it all this simple? Was it just a cultural oversight? Or was it a carefully crafted system designed to treat people like property? In this video, we will answer these questions and explore how the Ottoman Empire strengthened this system and how it influenced history. By bringing these testimonies to light, we must accept that this was a system without which the empire could not have existed. The Ottoman Empire, an empire stretching across vast lands, was built upon many systems, one of the darkest being the systematic exploitation of women and girls. These women were not just victims of circumstance. Their fate was engineered through institutionalized policies that commodified their very existence. It was an empire that didn't just turn a blind eye to human trafficking, it perfected it. The most vulnerable, women and children, were reduced to mere property to be bartered, sold, and traded at the whim of the ruling elite. Women were acquired in various ways, but the primary method was through military raids. The Ottoman forces were not only interested in land or riches, they were after human capital, human beings whose value could be quantified in terms of physical attributes, sexual appeal, and their ability to reproduce. They invaded civilian populations across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and parts of Africa, capturing women and girls as young as 6 or 7. These raids were not impulsive acts of violence, but well-organized operations, often planned years in advance. Villages were surrounded, and the inhabitants, particularly women, were taken captive. They were separated from their families, and their lives were changed forever, often before they could even fully understand what was happening. The women and girls were then transported to markets, where they were sold like livestock. In Istanbul, one of the most infamous markets was the Avaret Pasalara, or the female slave bazaar, where women were bought and sold with a business-like efficiency. Merchants, often from within the empire, would examine the slaves closely, checking their physical attributes. These women were valued based on their appearance, fertility, and sexual potential. A young, healthy white woman could command prices as high as 6,000 kurus, while African women were considered less valuable and sold for as little as 1,500 kurus. Their value, calculated not by their minds or hearts, but purely by their bodies, was a direct reflection of the empire's priorities. The women were reduced to their market value, how much they could be sold for, how much they could work, and how many children they could bear. But it wasn't just the human trafficking trade that enabled the empire to function. The Ottoman state actively regulated, taxed, and profited from these human transactions. It was a lucrative business, not hidden in the shadows, but fully integrated into the empire's official economic structure. Officials kept detailed records of every transaction, registering women and girls in the same way they would register the sale of cattle or land. The system was so efficient that it operated like a well-oiled machine, with merchants and officials working together to ensure the continued flow of women into the empire's economy. Slaves were not just a byproduct of conquests. They were a resource managed with the same level of bureaucratic care that was applied to other aspects of imperial governance. What is perhaps most chilling about this system is the role of the state, in not only facilitating these practices but in legitimizing them. The empire created a legal framework that supported human trafficking. Women who were enslaved had no rights, no recourse to justice. A slave owner could do whatever they wanted with their property. It was legal for a Muslim man to have sexual relations with his female slaves, a practice that was condoned by the very laws meant to govern the empire. This legal distinction, where slave women were treated as property, ensured that the exploitation of these women was not just common practice, but was woven into the fabric of Ottoman law. In one of the most horrifying aspects of this system, women who were captured and sold into slavery were expected to adapt to their new lives with little to no resistance. They were conditioned, often from a young age, to accept their fate. Many women who arrived in the empire, after suffering unimaginable abuse and trauma during their capture, were forced into submission by those who owned them. They were taught to serve, to entertain, and when necessary, to fulfill the sexual desires of the empire's elite. The sense of personal autonomy was stripped away. For these women, the entire concept of freedom was a distant memory. Their identities were replaced with new names, new purposes, and new roles assigned by those who bought them. The horrific truth is that these women were not seen as individuals with thoughts, dreams, or aspirations. They were seen as tools, their bodies a means to an end. Their worth was measured solely by their ability to perform, whether it be for domestic labor or for sexual exploitation. Women who failed to meet the expectations of their owners or were deemed too old or too weak for sexual use were often discarded. They were sold off, abandoned, or in some cases left to die. This was not just an occasional abuse of power, it was the system. Women lived their lives in fear, constantly aware that their worth was dependent on their ability to serve. When they could no longer serve, their lives were thrown away. The tragic reality of this system went far beyond just physical abuse. The emotional trauma of living as a slave, forced to constantly perform and fight for one's survival, was immeasurable. Women who lived in the harems or were kept as concubines often faced a lifetime of emotional isolation. Their lives were controlled, manipulated, and directed by those who held power over them. Many of these women, even those who managed to survive their captivity, carried invisible scars for the rest of their lives. They were denied their humanity, reduced to mere property in the eyes of the empire. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a chilling and systematic process unfolded behind the ornate walls and grandiose palaces. It was in the markets where the most vulnerable women and girls were reduced to commodities to be bought and sold without any regard for their humanity. These markets were not merely a byproduct of an empire. They were an essential part of its lifeblood. The female slave bazaar in Istanbul was infamous for its scale and cruelty, a place where young women were paraded like livestock, their worth determined by their bodies, their youth, and their potential to serve. Picture the scene, a bustling, dark marketplace filled with the murmurs of merchants and buyers, the scent of sweat and fear hanging thick in the air. Women, their eyes dull and lifeless, lined up in rows for inspection. Each woman, from the youngest to the oldest, was treated the same, as a product on display, her worth estimated by the buyer with cold, clinical precision. Their bodies were evaluated, their physical attributes noted down with meticulous care. Buyers would check their teeth, examine their breasts for signs of fertility, and evaluate their skin to gauge their health. The process was dehumanizing, reducing a woman to nothing more than an object of exchange, her value calculated based on her ability to provide sexual services, bear children, or fulfill domestic labor. The pricing structure in these markets was deeply rooted in racial and physical hierarchies. White women, especially those from European regions, commanded the highest prices. They were perceived as more desirable for both domestic service and sexual exploitation. The prices for them ranged from 3,000 to 6,000 kurus, depending on their appearance and age. However, the price plummeted when it came to African women and girls, who were often sold for as little as 1,500 kurus. Even within these categories, the women were further divided, with those from Syria or the Caucasus fetching a middle price, valued for their exotic beauty and reproductive capabilities. The market created a cruel system where women were classified by race, with the ultimate goal of sexual or labor exploitation. It wasn't just the buying and selling of women that made this system so horrific. It was the bureaucracy behind it, the government's official involvement in regulating and profiting from this market. The Ottoman Empire did not simply tolerate the trade of human beings, it facilitated and organized it. Officials kept meticulous records of every transaction, from the price of each woman to the names of the buyers and sellers. These records were carefully maintained to ensure that the trade ran smoothly, with taxes levied on each sale and ownership transfer. The process was so normalized that it became a part of the routine administrative duties of the state. Human trafficking, in the eyes of the empire, was as legitimate as any other trade. The markets were not just physical spaces. They were symbols of the empire's power over life and death, its ability to control the bodies of women and use them to further its imperial ambitions. These markets operated with bureaucratic precision, ensuring that the demand for human flesh was met efficiently, often at the expense of the most vulnerable people. The systematic nature of this trade reveals the deep-seated brutality of the empire, a civilization that prided itself on its grandeur while quietly reducing thousands of women to objects for sale. But what does this tell us about the nature of the Ottoman Empire? Could such barbarism truly exist within a society so advanced, so civilized? As we look deeper into this history, we realize that the empire's grandeur and glory were built upon the suffering and exploitation of countless women and girls who were bought, sold, and abused like chattel. These practices were not anomalies. They were foundational to the empire's social and economic structures. Now we must ask, what was it about the Ottoman Empire that allowed such systemic dehumanization to thrive for so long? How could a society so sophisticated on the surface participate in one of the most heinous forms of human exploitation? And what does this history teach us about power, control, and the ways in which societies normalize the exploitation of the powerless? It's a question worth considering as we look back at this dark chapter in history. The female slave bazaars were not just a tragic relic of the past. They were part of a deeply embedded system that shaped the very foundation of the empire. The markets were a testament to the fact that even the most powerful empires can harbor the darkest secrets. They were a reminder of how, throughout history, women have been reduced to commodities in the hands of those in power. The Ottoman Empire's system of slavery was not limited to physical exploitation alone. It was a complete system that also promoted psychological oppression. Women were not just made physical slaves. Their minds were also taken over. They were expected to see themselves as weak and subordinate, and accept their status as their fate. The deepest impact of this system was on the mental state of women, which not only paralyzed their bodies, but also their emotions and thoughts. These women lost their identity. They were seen only as bodies, existing for one purpose: sexual service. Every day was a new day where they had to strip away their humanity just to prove their existence. They had no say in their fate. Their lives were void of freedom. It was a trap where women suffocated, and their freedom remained nothing but a distant dream. Within this system, if a woman didn't fit her place properly, it meant she was soon either discarded or transferred to another man. Women who failed to meet their master's expectations were removed from society. Their bodies and minds were squeezed so harshly that even if they survived, their lives held no hope. They lived a life of silent suffering, where every day's agony left a scar on their body and soul. Even those women who were deemed acceptable, according to their body's worth, were never truly happy. They had no future, no desires. They either remained in sexual service to their master, or were subjected to further exploitation through various deceitful means. Even those women who managed to escape this system didn't find life easy. The fear, pain, and deep psychological wounds remained with them throughout their lives. The most heartbreaking truth is that the cruelty of this system wasn't just physical, but deeply mental. These women's lives were meant solely to prove their physical worth and exist as an item for others, and women who attempted to break free from this system were subjected to even more torment. Their lives were never complete. The wounds in their souls, knowing their worth was reduced to their body, never healed. Another serious truth is that there was no social or moral support system for these women. There was no system to aid them, and the system that existed only intensified their exploitation. Even if they managed to escape, the deep scars left in their hearts had no cure. Their souls were like broken bodies, never able to feel whole again. The most tragic aspect of this system was that it was so organized that it affected every level of society. This wasn't just an issue for one or two families. It was a political matter for an entire empire. The Ottoman Empire not only tolerated this system of slavery, but also provided social and legal justification for it, making exploitation a normal part of life. This is the legacy that we still feel today. The glory and grandeur of the Ottoman Empire rested upon the blood, pain, and sacrifices of these women. It is a bitter truth that we cannot turn a blind eye to. Perhaps now is the time to remember their stories, so we do not forget what happened to them in history and truly understand the depth of their suffering. Now is the time to take a brief pause and reflect on the horrific truths we've just heard, to better understand the weight of these events. Facing this reality is heartbreaking, but it's not just a chapter from history. The echoes of these stories still exist in modern society. In different parts of the world, women are still suffering, and their pain is a result of the lingering effects of this system. Is this the truth we've forgotten? Are these women's stories truly lost forever? Have we really forgotten their suffering? These are the questions we must ask ourselves. Ignoring this dark chapter of history is perhaps an even greater crime. The pain of these women is not something relegated to the past. It is a present-day reality that still impacts us. The physical and psychological scars they bore remind us how we treated women as weaker beings, undervaluing their lives and suppressing their rightful desires. Now is the time to not only remember these stories, but to recognize their enduring impact. These atrocities are still echoed today, and perhaps, by acknowledging them, we can begin to do better. As we close this dark chapter of history, it's important to understand that the exploitation of women in the Ottoman Empire wasn't just a horrific moment in time. It was part of a broader, systematic practice that shaped the empire and reverberated across generations. These women lived lives marked by brutality, isolation, and dehumanization. Their stories lost in the shadows of history, waiting to be told. But even though the empire fell centuries ago, the effects of its actions still echo today. The lessons from this grim past are just as relevant in today's world as they were then. By acknowledging these forgotten chapters, we not only honor the memory of those who suffered, but also recognize the ongoing struggles women face in many parts of the world. The exploitation they endured reminds us of the importance of fighting for justice and equality. If you found this history compelling, I urge you to learn more and share these untold stories. By educating ourselves and others, we can ensure that the horrors faced by these women are never forgotten and that such injustices are never allowed to happen again. In our next episode, we'll dive into the political strategies that kept these systems in place for centuries. Don't miss it. The real story is only beginning to unfold.